we now arrive at a pivotal chapter in its history, its arrival in Europe. This moment wasn't just about trade or taste, it was a turning point. When tea touched European shores, it quietly sparked a transformation that would ripple through centuries. It was the beginning of a new cultural rhythm. One small, fragrant leaf began to seep into every corner of society, altering habits, shaping rituals, and redefining the cadence of daily life. For the elite, tea was an expression of wealth and worldliness, poured from delicate porcelain imported from the East. It trickled down from the drawing rooms of nobles into the calloused hands of factory workers. It was sipped in gilded salons and cold workshops alike. Tea bridged the gap between the rich and the poor, the powerful and the working class. It offered comfort, energy, and routine, becoming a steady ritual in lives marked by change and hardship. And for intellectuals, tea was the quiet companion to deep thought, literary discussion, and philosophical debate. This is the story of how tea enchanted a continent, not all at once, but cup by cup. It influenced fashion, conversation, and even revolution. In Europe, tea became much more than a drink. It evolved into a living symbol of status, sophistication, and subtle rebellion. But tea's story in Europe didn't remain confined to palaces and parlors. And as empires rose and fell, as revolutions brewed and borders shifted, tea remained a symbol not just of refinement, but resilience. In France, in Britain, across the Low Countries and beyond, tea helped define a European identity that was always evolving, always absorbing, where teapots pour power, and where rebellion sometimes brews stronger than the tea itself. The first cup, early arrival of tea in Europe. Tea's first appearance in Europe was not born of war, empire, or religious mission, but of wonder. In the early 1600s, as Europe peered eastward with wide eyes and open sails, the great seafaring nations, Portugal and the Netherlands, launched voyages not just for conquest, but for commerce. Among them was a young woman destined to become a quiet but powerful cultural bridge, Catherine of Braganza. Their ships, brimming with silks, porcelain, and fragrant spices, returned with something less expected, curious, curled leaves that carried a scent of distant mountains and temples. These were not just commodities, they were mysteries in a crate, strange botanical fragments wrapped in myth, medicine, and ritual. But in truth, it was the planting of a seed. A new rhythm of social life began to take root. Among the English aristocracy, tea soon became not just fashionable, but essential, a delicate moment of grace and pause in a rapidly changing world. What started as an aristocratic fascination soon matured into a powerful social marker, not just for wealth, but for taste, status, and moral superiority. Each porcelain cup held more than steeped leaves. It held the weight of distant voyages, merchant risk, and imperial ambition. The dried leaves arrived from China, tightly sealed in chests, having traveled thousands of miles across treacherous seas. Once in England, they were subject to steep taxes, making tea a prized and often guarded commodity. Its costliness only heightened its desirability, especially among the upper class, who flaunted their refinement through elaborate tea sets and ornate tea rituals. The Dutch East India Company, one of the most powerful trading forces in the world, began importing tea as early as 1606, delivering it to curious apothecaries and aristocrats in Amsterdam. A commodity at the intersection of trade, taxation, and colonial ambition. What had been a luxury for the few was becoming a necessity for the many. And with that shift came friction. These bustling. Tea was marketed with a new, clever edge, not just as a drink. The company had established a near-total monopoly on Britain's trade with China, and with it, manipulated public demand for it. Tea was clean, calming, and cerebral, ideal for the thoughtful man or modest woman. They portrayed tea as a product of empire, a taste of the exotic made safe by British power, control over the tea supply, but as a healing elixir. Space's melancholy, fatigue, equally ambitious, brought the leaf home through their vast network of ports in Goa, Macau, and beyond, and digestive trouble. Often when she married King Charles II of England, she brought with her not just titles and diplomacy, but a chest of Eastern treasures. Described as it may have seemed a mere habit, a sip of tea in the quiet hours between noon and supper. Penny. Universities. She introduced the ritual of afternoon tea to the English court, a custom that, of tea's earliest adopters, were not merchants or sailors, but nobles, those with the leisure, wealth, and curiosity to indulge in Eastern customs. The 17th, carried across oceans in the hands of a queen, Europe's love affair with tea truly began, would send ripples through British culture for centuries to come. Century Catherine was well acquainted with tea long before it graced English cups, became early battlegrounds in the cultural war between beverages, while coffee and chocolate reigned as favorites. Advertisements proclaimed it a remedy for headaches. By the early 1700s, they didn't just import tea, they marketed it, promoted it. Unlike ale or gin, the Portuguese it was served in delicate porcelain at her family's court, not just as refreshment, but as a refined gesture of civility and status, a drink fit for Enlightenment minds and Protestant virtues. And in 1662, among the jewels, silks, and spices was tea in Portugal. For when Catherine arrived in England, while modest in its beginnings, born into the Portuguese royal family, this royal dowry would prove more influential than gold to some. From this single chest of tea, the British love affair begins. Following Queen Catherine's quiet yet influential ritual, tea began to trickle through the corridors of English society. Throughout the late 1600s and early 1700s, tea remained a luxury item, its scarcity amplifying its mystique. Meanwhile, in the coffee houses of London, another transformation was underway. As intellectuals, businessmen, and philosophers gathered over steaming cups, tea began to symbolize modernity. It was rational, controlled, civilized, but tea's spread wasn't merely cultural, it was strategic. Behind the scenes stood a rising titan, the British East India Company. Tea was no longer just an import, it was a political tool. But the more it grew in popularity, the more problems brewed beneath the surface: smuggling, addiction, class tension, and rising resentment over royal taxes. The age of reverent sipping was giving way to an age of rebellion. Tea and theft, smuggling and taxes. As Britain's appetite for tea grew insatiable, so too did the government's ambition to profit from it. By the mid-18th century, the British Crown had levied crushing taxes on imported tea, sometimes adding as much as 119% to its original price. What had begun as a luxurious sip of the elite was quickly becoming an inaccessible indulgence for the common household. But the British people were not so easily deterred. Rather than give up their beloved beverage, the nation turned to the shadows. A vast black market for tea began to flourish. Smugglers, known as free traders in coastal folklore, made nightly voyages from the shores of Holland and France, their small ships packed with untaxed Chinese tea. Local taverns, kitchens, and even churches were transformed into storage and distribution centers. Custom officers, who were supposed to enforce the Crown's law, were often bribed, threatened, or simply turned a blind eye. Some unscrupulous traders would collect used leaves from the homes of the rich, re-dry them, dye them with copper or black lead, and resell them as fresh imports. British Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger introduced the Commutation Act, a bold reform that slashed tea taxes from 119% to a mere 12.5%. The logic was simple. Legal, affordable tea would destroy the black market overnight. In many towns, smuggling wasn't just common, it was a way of life. These smugglers weren't isolated criminals. They were entire communities: fishermen, farmers, housewives, and even clergymen, all complicit in the underground supply chain. High-quality tea without risking their health or their liberty. The smuggler's brew gave way to the public's cup. Entire villages in southern England and Ireland became hubs of illicit tea. What had once been a symbol of elite power was now brewed on hearths in humble cottages and bustling urban flats. And this shadowy commerce came with consequences. To meet rising demand and maximize profit, smugglers began adulterating their wares. The result was a public health risk and a national scandal. Despite the dangers, the black market economy continued to thrive. By the 1770s, it was estimated that over half of the tea consumed in Britain was illegally sourced. This growing rebellion against taxation became impossible to ignore. Finally, in 1784, a seismic shift arrived, and it worked. Within months, smugglers were out of business. Tea, once trafficked under moonlight and hidden in church crypts. The Commutation Act didn't just restore order, it democratized tea, cementing it as a staple of British life across every class. The smuggling era had come to an end, but the story of tea was far from over. Tea, trade, and war. When the cup ran over by the late 18th century, Britain's obsession with tea had spiraled into a national craving. Morning, afternoon, and evening, the ritual of tea drinking had woven itself into the very fabric of British identity. Imports soared. From the drawing rooms of London's elite to the humblest factory workers' break time, tea had become not just a beverage, but a necessity. But this cultural addiction came with an economic price. At the time, China held a near-total monopoly on the world's supply of tea. They saw the West as culturally inferior and had no desire for foreign wares. For the British, this meant a severe trade imbalance. Silver, the hard currency of empires, was flowing out of Britain at an alarming rate. The delicate green and black leaves were cultivated in the misty hills of Fujian and Yunnan, carefully harvested by hand and packed into tightly sealed chests for the long voyage west. The British East India Company, the commercial powerhouse behind England's trade empire, was buying enormous quantities of Chinese tea every year. The trade imbalance was solved, but at a devastating human cost. In 1839, Imperial Commissioner Lin Zexu seized and destroyed over 20,000 chests of opium in a bold effort to end the foreign scourge. The British, with superior naval firepower, easily crushed the Qing resistance. His defiance, seen by Britain as an affront to free trade and property rights, sparked the First Opium War. And there was a problem. China only accepted payment in silver. The Chinese court, under the Qing dynasty, had little interest in British textiles, wool, or manufactured goods. By the early 1800s, British silver reserves were depleting. The tea trade was draining the empire's wealth faster than it could recover. Something had to change. And what came next would be one of the darkest pivots in imperial history. In a desperate bid to reverse the silver outflow, Britain turned to a different export: opium. The balance of power in Asia had shifted, all because of a drink that Britain couldn't give up, and a price it refused to keep paying. The plan was simple and sinister. Britain had control over large parts of India, where poppies could be cultivated in vast plantations. Behind every porcelain cup of English breakfast was a chain of suffering that stretched across oceans and continents. The opium extracted from these plants was then trafficked illegally into China. Despite Chinese laws forbidding the import of narcotics, the East India Company and its partners funneled tons of opium into Chinese ports, especially Canton. The drug was addictive, potent, and profitable. By the 1830s, millions of Chinese citizens had become dependent on opium, from dock workers to bureaucrats. Silver, once flowing out of Britain to China, was now flowing back into British hands, paid by addicted Chinese consumers. As addiction ravaged Chinese society, the Qing government finally moved to intervene. This conflict wasn't fought over tea leaves or poppies, but over control of trade routes, profit margins, and geopolitical influence. The result was the Treaty of Nanking in 1842, the first of many so-called unequal treaties. China was forced to cede Hong Kong to Britain, pay millions in silver reparations, and open several ports to British merchants, including opium traffickers. The once symbiotic tea trade had become a mechanism of imperial domination, and so the very leaves that had once symbolized elegance and civility in British drawing rooms were now tied to addiction, war, and colonial violence. The Opium Wars marked a turning point in both British imperialism and Chinese sovereignty. The Opium War, the cost of tea addiction. By 1839, the Chinese Empire stood at a breaking point. For years, opium, a foreign poison smuggled in by British merchants, had flooded into Chinese cities and countryside alike. Addiction was no longer a fringe problem. It had become a national crisis. Mothers, scholars, soldiers, and farmers, All had fallen under the narcotics' grip. And for every chest of opium sold, Britain grew richer. The silver flowed back to London, and in return, more Chinese tea flowed into English porcelain cups. In a dramatic and symbolic act, Lin had them destroyed in public view, dumped into trenches, mixed with lime and salt water, and flushed into the Pearl River. It was a statement to Britain, to the world, and to the Chinese people that China would not be enslaved by foreign greed. But the Chinese government could no longer remain silent. That same year, Commissioner Lin Zexu, an esteemed scholar and statesman, was appointed by the emperor to lead a decisive crackdown. Lin was not only principled, he was determined. In Canton, the heart of foreign trade, he demanded the surrender of all British opium stocks, and the British complied, reluctantly. Over 20,000 chests of opium, amounting to more than 1.3 million kilograms, were seized. But this act of resistance triggered a storm. Within months, British warships were dispatched, their cannons aimed squarely at Chinese ports. Rather than seeing it as a moral stand, the British government interpreted it as a violation of property rights and a threat to their expanding empire. What followed was not a fair fight. The Chinese navy and militias, though courageous, were technologically outmatched. The British Navy bombarded coastal cities, destroyed fortifications, and cut off trade routes with ruthless efficiency. What had started as a genteel ritual, pinkies lifted, saucers clinked, had spiraled into geopolitical violence. No longer just a beverage, tea had become a symbol of control, currency, and coercion. It was no longer about taste, it was about power. The First Opium War had begun, a clash between an aging dynasty clinging to tradition and an industrialized empire armed with steamships, iron hulls, and modern artillery. In 1842, the Treaty of Nanking was signed under duress, and its terms were devastating. And China, once proud and self-sufficient, was left fractured and forcibly opened to the West. After 3 years of humiliating defeats, China was forced to surrender. Among the clauses, Hong Kong was ceded to Britain, setting the stage for more than 150 years of foreign rule. 5 major ports, including Shanghai and Canton, were forced open to British trade. China was required to pay millions in silver as reparations for destroyed opium and war costs. British citizens in China were granted extraterritorial rights, meaning they were subject to British, not Chinese, laws. It was the beginning of what China would later call the century of humiliation. And at the root of it all, tea, a plant that symbolized refinement and grace in British society, had, on the other side of the world, become a catalyst for war, addiction, and imperial conquest. This moment marked a turning point, not just in the story of tea, but in the story of empire. Britain had proven it would go to war, real war, to protect its tea supply. European traditions outside Britain, the French approach, as tea swept across Europe. Not every nation steeped it the same way. While Britain ritualized the drink into a symbol of discipline, the French never rushed to turn tea into routine. They didn't need it for factory workers or maritime dominance. Instead, tea became an extension of aesthetic life, an indulgence for the senses, a moment of poetry in a porcelain cup. By the early 18th century, French aristocrats had embraced tea not as medicine and confections, macarons, madeleines, creating pairings that mirrored France's long-standing devotion to culinary harmony. The act of drinking tea was slow, conversational, and intimate. Between sips, guests would exchange gossip, debate poetry, or simply admire one another's fashions. Silks rustling, fans fluttering, jewelry catching the candlelight. With roots tracing back to the French East India Company and centuries of trade with Asia, the Mirage family brought exotic blends into Paris with unmatched sophistication. A cup of Marco Polo might evoke a voyage across spice-laden seas. Rouge d'Automne could summon an autumn stroll through Versailles. Their salons attracted artists, designers, authors, and socialites, a world away from the political coffeehouses of London or the pragmatic tea rooms of Britain. The emphasis was not on ritual, but on atmosphere. Their tea salons resembled apothecaries of luxury, shelves lined with black canisters, antique tea scales, and menus that read more like poetry than product lists. Walk through La Mare in Paris, and you'll find the scent of bergamot wafting through narrow streets. Delicate blends displayed in boutique windows, and cafe-goers lingering over an Earl Grey not out of necessity but desire. A quiet rebellion against the rigidity of European norms. Tea was reserved for the elite, dukes, duchesses, courtiers, and patrons of the arts. And unlike the bold, tannic brews preferred by the British, the French favored delicately scented teas, jasmine-infused green tea, silver needle leaves laced with rose petals, and oolong mixed with orange blossom. Tea was not consumed for health or habit. It was performed, an art form in itself. It was a perfumed experience. In the ornate salons of Paris, tea was often served alongside delicate pastries. In these gilded tea salons, tea became a stage. The porcelain was hand-painted, the silverware shone, and nowhere did this art form crystallize more beautifully than in the rise of iconic Parisian tea houses, most notably Mirage, founded in Aix-en-Provence. Mirage wasn't just a tea merchant, it was an institution. Each blend was given a story, a mood, a memory, a place. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Mirage and others had established tea as a symbol of French refinement. To drink tea in France was not to reinforce empire or adhere to a social schedule. It was to participate in pleasure, poise, and perfume. Even today, you can feel this legacy. In France, tea never became routine. It remained a moment to savor, a secret between the leaves, and a love letter to the senses. Russia, the tea road and the samovar in the vast, frost-bitten expanse of Imperial Russia. Tea took a very different route than it did through most of Europe, not by ship, but by hoof, cart, and caravan. While the British and Dutch relied on ocean trade, tea arrived in Russia, overland via the legendary Siberian Tea Road, an ancient, rugged trade route stretching over 6,000 kilometers from the tea markets of China through Mongolia, across the Ural Mountains and into the heart of Moscow. The journey could take up to 16 months, and the precious cargo was carried by camel caravans across deserts, forests, and snow-laden steppes. To endure this journey, tea was pressed into dense bricks, dark and tightly packed. These bricks made transport easier and also preserved the leaves. In many regions, tea bricks even functioned as currency, traded for furs, grain, and other essentials along the road. Once it reached Russian soil, however, tea didn't just survive, it flourished. In a land of long winters and vast isolation, warmth and togetherness were not luxuries, they were survival. Unlike the polished salons of Paris or the punctual rituals of London, Russian tea culture grew out of necessity, climate, and connection. Tea was served in fine porcelain cups. It was both royal and rustic, sophisticated and simple. It became the language of comfort, a remedy for cold, a symbol of hospitality. Guests were always offered tea first, before meals, before business, before anything else. To refuse tea was often seen as rude or strange. Surrounded by crystal bowls of lemon slices, tea had become embedded in Russian identity. Literature, art, and music all echoed its presence. In the works of Tolstoy, Chekhov, and Dostoevsky, characters often pause to pour tea, not just as background noise, but as moments of reflection, tension, or intimacy. Honey and fruit preserves. In peasant cottages, it was more modest, but no less sacred. The samovar stood at the center of the home like a glowing metal heart, around which generations would gather, talk, argue, sing, and pass the time. At the center of this tradition was the samovar, a brilliant invention that came to define Russian tea rituals. Instead, they practiced a distinctive and endearing custom, holding a lump of sugar or a spoonful of jam between their teeth while sipping the hot tea. The sweetness mingled with the warmth mid-sip, a gentle, intimate blend of flavor and ritual. The samovar remains a powerful symbol of Russian warmth in a cold world. Whether electric or antique, it speaks of time, patience, and shared presence. The slow, breathing rhythm of a culture that found comfort in ritual, resilience in the bitter chill, and meaning in the steam rising from a porcelain cup. Tall, ornate, the samovar was a combination water boiler and hearth, designed to keep water hot for hours, even all day. Each person would pour a splash of Zavarka into their cup, then dilute it with steaming water from the samovar to their preferred strength. There was no fixed formula, only taste, tradition, and shared time. Fueled by coal or wood in its early days, it transformed the act of tea drinking into a slow, communal ritual. Perched atop the samovar was a small teapot filled with Zavarka, a highly concentrated black tea brew, rich and strong. And unlike their Western counterparts, Russians rarely stirred sugar directly into their tea. In aristocratic homes, tea in Russia transcended class by the 19th century. Even today, Germany, an unexpected tea stronghold. When you think of Germany, visions of frothy beer steins and robust coffee houses often come to mind. Tea, by contrast, has always played a more modest role across much of the country. It traces its origins back to the 17th century, when the region's maritime traders and merchants imported tea from the Dutch East Indies. Despite its small size, East Frisia rapidly developed a deep affection for the exotic leaf, transforming it into something uniquely their own. On the side, you'll find klunkjes, large, clear, hard rock sugar crystals harvested from nearby mines. These sugar lumps are never stirred into the tea. Instead, they slowly melt as the tea warms them, providing a satisfying crunch between sips, and a sweet, subtle contrast to the strong brew. Declining a cup is rare and often seen as impolite, where the strength of the brew matches the resilience of the people. In this northern corner of Germany, tea quietly but powerfully asserts its place, not in grand palaces or bustling, but around simple tables warmed by friendship and time-honored ritual. The ritual encourages lingering conversation, shared stories, and the slow savoring of moments. It is a time to pause, reflect, and build bonds, especially important in a region where winter winds howl and daylight is short. Yet, in one small corner of northern Germany, the windswept coastal region of East Frisia, tea has carved out a distinct and enduring cultural niche, becoming not just a beverage, but a ceremony steeped in local identity and warmth. East Frisia's tea culture is an unexpected jewel amid Germany's hearty brews and café culture. Here, tea is never weak or diluted. It's brewed boldly and black, thick with flavor, a true tonic for the often chilly, windy climate. But the magic lies not just in the tea itself, but in the way it is served and savored. In a traditional East Frisian tea setting, the tea is poured into delicate porcelain cups, often adorned with fine floral patterns, evoking a gentle elegance. The cream doesn't mix, but instead rests in soft, swirling clouds on the surface, a visual and textural delight. The cream balances the sharpness of the tea and the sweetness of the clunches, creating a layered experience for the palate. Adding to the ritual is a generous spoonful of heavy cream, carefully floated on top of the tea. Tea isn't hurried or taken casually, it is sacred time. A guest is traditionally offered 3 cups of tea, each prepared fresh and served one after another. This tradition is captured in the beloved local saying, "Dreimal ist Ostfriesenrecht," meaning 3 times is East Frisian law. A defining feature of East Frisian tea culture is its strict etiquette and rhythm. The 3 cups represent hospitality, respect, and connection. Tea in East Frisia is more than a drink. It's a cultural heartbeat, a tradition that unites community and family. Industrialization, tea for the masses. As the thunderous engines of the Industrial Revolution roared across Europe in the late 18th and 19th centuries, society itself was being reshaped, and so was the role of tea. What had once been an exclusive luxury of the aristocracy and wealthy elite gradually transformed into a lifeline for the emerging working class, enduring the relentless pace of industrial labor. Factories and textile mills sprang up like steel giants, drawing millions from the countryside into crowded urban centers. Its caffeine provided a mild stimulant effect, enough to boost concentration and stave off fatigue without the downsides of stronger beverages. The tea break took shape as a small but meaningful pause during long workdays, a moment for workers to step away from their machines, share a cup, and recharge. These breaks became early precursors to the modern workplace culture of scheduled rest, productivity, and well-being. The work was grueling and unforgiving. Long hours, monotonous tasks, harsh conditions, and barely any respite. Transformation of tea from a symbol of aristocratic elegance to a staple of working-class life illustrates how this simple beverage adapted to the social and economic upheavals of the age. Tea had become, quite literally, fuel for the Industrial Revolution, steeped in steam, sweat, and shared humanity. In this environment, tea emerged as an essential companion, a source of warmth, energy, and brief relief from the daily grind. Unlike heavier alcoholic drinks, which could impair alertness or be prohibited by employers, tea was quick to prepare and easy to consume. Recognizing these benefits, some employers began to formally encourage tea breaks. Near factories, tea rooms, and humble sprang up like oases. These venues offered inexpensive cups of tea, often paired with simple baked goods or sandwiches, accessible to even the lowest paid workers. For many, these spaces provided more than just refreshment. They were places of social connection and refuge. The rise of tea rooms had a particularly profound impact on working women. At a time when public spaces were often dominated by men and alcohol-fueled taverns were inhospitable or unsafe, tea rooms offered a respectable, alcohol-free environment where women could gather without judgment. They became centers of community, conversation, and camaraderie, nurturing bonds of solidarity among laborers. The transformation of tea from a symbol of aristocratic elegance to a staple of working-class life illustrates how this simple beverage adapted to the social and economic upheavals of the age. Tea had become, quite literally, fuel for the Industrial Revolution, steeped in steam, sweat, and shared humanity. The birth of the tea bag and commercialization. The dawn of the 20th century brought with it a flurry of innovation to keep the loose tea leaves contained. He used small silk pouches, a simple and practical packaging choice. People loved the convenience and cleanliness of brewing tea without loose leaves scattering in their cups. This seemingly small misunderstanding was the seed that planted one of the biggest innovations in tea history, the tea bag. However, what happened next was pure serendipity. Customers, not realizing these were just sample bags, dunked the entire pouch directly into hot water rather than emptying the leaves. The tea bag simplified the process, while big brands built trust and recognition. This era marked a pivotal moment. Tea became the drink of the modern age, convenient, affordable, and woven deeply into the fabric of everyday life. Together, they guaranteed that tea would never again be confined to the drawing rooms of the elite or the hands of the wealthy few. And one small, accidental invention would soon revolutionize the tea industry and how millions of people around the world enjoyed their daily cup. In 1908, a New York tea merchant named Thomas Sullivan was shipping out tea samples to his customers. To Sullivan's surprise, this method worked remarkably well. In rapidly industrializing cities, where lifestyles were growing busier and more fast-paced, the tea bag's ease of use, speed, and portability made it an instant hit. No more fiddling with infusers or straining loose leaves. A quick dunk, and tea was ready. By the 1920s, tea bags were being commercially produced and marketed. Still an American invention, but one that quickly found favor across the Atlantic. Brands like Twinings, Yorkshire Tea, and Lipton became household names across Europe and beyond. They introduced familiar, consistent flavors at affordable prices, ensuring tea was no longer a rare luxury but a democratic staple of daily life. At the same time, large tea brands began to emerge and dominate the market, standardizing not just the packaging but the blends themselves. This mass commercialization did more than increase accessibility. It helped cement tea as a cultural mainstay, transcending class barriers and becoming a beloved ritual for millions. From the accidental innovation of a New York tea merchant to the shelves of European grocery stores. Tea during World War I and II. Tea, often seen as a simple daily pleasure, took on a far deeper significance during the turmoil of the world wars, particularly in Britain. During both World War I and World War II, tea was considered an essential ration for soldiers. The ritual of brewing and sharing tea was a way to momentarily forget the horrors surrounding them, a brief pause that helped sustain mental strength. It was a moment of calm in the chaos of battle. Armies structured entire campaigns to ensure tea supplies reached the troops, whether in the trenches of Europe or the deserts of North Africa. For soldiers enduring cold, wet conditions, hunger, and fear, tea was a small but powerful reminder of home, warmth, and normalcy. Back in Britain, the government recognized the strategic importance of tea to civilian morale. Posters, radio broadcasts, and community efforts reminded people that tea was more than a drink. It was a shared ritual that brought people together, bolstered spirits, and anchored daily life, even in the darkest times. No longer confined to the modest cups of hard-working laborers or the stiff rituals of aristocratic afternoons, tea today pulses at the heart of modern creativity, wellness, and cultural fusion. They source rare leaves from remote plantations worldwide. Every cup is curated to honor the environment and the farmers behind it. A far cry from mass-produced blends of the past. Here, exotic blends and innovative preparations have taken center stage, from the bright, grassy notes of Japanese matcha lattes to the spicy warmth of Indian chai masala, the earthy sweetness of South African rooibos, and the surreal, shimmering hues of butterfly pea flower tea. This meant that tea imports, storage, and distribution were centrally controlled and prioritized. Despite the relentless threat of German bombings, naval blockades, and rationing hardships, the ministry ensured that tea remained available. Carefully rationed, it speaks to a desire for connection. It is no longer just a drink, but a key ingredient in detox regimens, skincare infusions, and mindfulness rituals designed to calm both body and mind. Stunning visuals of steaming cups surrounded by crystals, candles, and journal pages flood Instagram feeds. Elegant tea tastings are staged as immersive social experiences, blending education with style. From rooftop lounges to cozy living rooms, wellness seekers sip delicate herbal infusions while journaling or meditating, embracing tea as a symbol of intentional living and self-care. But never fully out of reach for any citizen, whether aristocrat or factory worker. Public morale campaigns sprang up, urging Britons to keep calm and put the kettle on. In this way, tea helped sustain the British people through adversity, proving that sometimes it's the smallest comforts that carry the greatest weight. Across vibrant urban centers like London, Paris, and Berlin, a new wave of cafes and tea houses have redefined what tea means for a globalized generation. These modern tea artisans are not just brewers, but storytellers. Tea has also deeply intertwined with the booming wellness movement. Social media influencers and wellness brands amplify this trend, centering tea within their aesthetics. In this way, tea has been reimagined and reclaimed, not just as a simple beverage, but as a vibrant, multifaceted lifestyle choice. The digital tea experience in the 21st century. Social media has played a surprising and transformative role in Europe's ongoing tea renaissance. Platforms like Instagram, Pinterest, and TikTok have turned tea from a simple daily ritual into a form of visual storytelling and art. These are not just photos, they are invitations into cozy, dreamlike worlds where time slows down and senses awaken. The aesthetic leans into cottagecore vibes, soft candlelight, rustic wood, wildflowers in mason jars, creating a warm sense of nostalgia and calm amidst the digital hustle. Scrolling through feeds, one encounters beautifully curated tea trays, delicate porcelain cups resting on vintage lace, bowls of blooming teas unfurling in slow motion, steam rising from perfectly poured kettles. These digital spaces are alive with exchange. People share brewing techniques, Tea ceremony tips. It invites everyone to sip, learn, and celebrate this ancient beverage in new and creative ways, continuing a story that spans centuries but feels fresh and vibrant in every digital scroll. Meanwhile, dedicated YouTube channels offer immersive explorations of tea culture, reviewing teas, demonstrating rituals, and connecting viewers with the wider story of tea's journey across continents and centuries. It softened long days and sparked intellectual awakenings. It adapted to every class, from kings and duchesses to factory workers and soldiers. And now, in the age of screens and it continues to evolve, and even deep dives into historical tea lore, much like the stories and knowledge you rehearing now. Tea in Europe is a symbol of elegance, of endurance, of connection. A simple leaf, infused with history, poured into millions of cups, each one carrying centuries of culture. But it's more than just pretty pictures. Virtual tea communities have blossomed across platforms, bringing together enthusiasts, novices, and experts alike. Remember, you're part of that legacy too. On TikTok, the hashtag #TTOK has exploded into a thriving subculture, with millions of views dedicated to everything from how to steep the perfect cup to creative tea recipes and unboxing rare tea leaves. This digital tea society represents a full-circle moment in tea's cultural history. What was once the exclusive domain of Enlightenment era salons, aristocratic parlors, and intellectual coffeehouses is now accessible to anyone, anywhere, with a phone or computer. Tea conversations happen in real time across borders, languages, and time zones, fostering connection, education, and shared appreciation on an unprecedented scale. In a way, social media has democratized tea culture, making it a living, evolving tradition that's both deeply personal and beautifully communal. Closing reflection. Tea's European legacy. Tea's influence in Europe is a story of transformation. From exclusivity to accessibility, from ritual to revolution, from war to wellness, it shaped empires and social movements more than just a drink. As you sip your next cup,